So next we have Steve Souders, who's going to be talking to us about measuring the real impact, sort of what really matters in performance. Steve is sort of the person who I think of as this person who's always demanding speed, but is very patient with the rest of us as we try to catch up in making things as fast as they should be. And he's written some great books and organizes the Velocity Conference, and I think we're ready to go. So please welcome Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Now, am I high, or are we like 10 minutes ahead of schedule, or both? So I did a 3-hour version of this talk last week. So cutting it down to 20 minutes was really difficult, so I'm going to milk that extra 10 minutes that I have. But I wanted to bring it down for a second. I wanted to talk about something Jason told me years ago. I've known Jason for a long time, and he probably doesn't remember this. He doesn't realize it, but he told me something that has really stuck with me, something very profound. He said, never do, what was he? I
have no idea.
I know. Always put the user first. Always focus on the user. So that seems pretty obvious, right? Whether you're a designer or a developer or a PM, you're trying to create the best user experience that you can. Something that's enjoyable, compelling, aesthetically pleasing, hopefully fast. And yet, I'm here to tell you that you're probably not measuring that. I doubt any of us in this room are measuring what it takes to deliver that fast, enjoyable user experience. From the user's perspective, they care what is that great user experience. It's getting the content that they want, having that delivered and being able to interact with that. So, to be honest, when it comes to performance metrics, we talk about things that users don't care about. Page load time, number of HTTP requests, how many kilobytes or megabytes of JavaScript we're delivering. I've never heard a user complain to me, there are way too many HTTP requests in this slow page, right? And so, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. I've been doing performance for over 12 years now, and it's only recently that I've started talking about how we need to focus on metrics that more closely approximate what that user experience is. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But first, we might want to ask ourselves, why is it we care about measuring performance, about measuring the speed of this user experience? And to that, I'll say, if you've heard me speak before, you know that there are dozens of these case studies that talk about the correlation between speed and performance and business metrics, reducing operating costs, increasing traffic, and getting a bump in all of those positive user metrics that we care about. Sessions per month, page views per session, session length. So hopefully, I can skip that part, although if I'd known I had an extra 10 minutes, I could have gone through it a little more slowly. And we can just all agree, fast is good. Are we all on the same page there? Yes. Okay. So, if fast is good, what can we do to create these faster user experiences? Okay, so a couple quick, simple things. Start measuring performance from the get-go, from the very beginning. It doesn't mean you optimize from the very beginning, but at least you're aware of where your pain points are, and you're thinking about that in the back of your mind when you're driving, when you're in the shower, when you're at conferences and you're listening to other people talk. Oh, we could use that in that area. But more importantly, it establishes that performance is something that's important to this project that you're working on. And it gets everyone thinking about what is our performance and tracking that. And you can make that more visible to the company by having these in-page reminders. This is a screenshot from a presentation by Laura Hogan, who works at Etsy. And what they do, and we did the same thing at Yahoo and Google, places where I worked, is if you're on the corporate IP, you get this extra widget in the page. And it actually reveals, surfaces, those performance metrics that you're tracking. So again, it makes that more visible to everyone in the organization. And what I love is when someone who's outside of development and design, someone in sales or customer support, are dogfooding the product, they're using the product, and they get a bad experience, they see these bad metrics being visualized right in the page, and they go and they talk to design and development and say, hey, I just wanted you to know this was really slow. And sometimes you can actually start debugging, right? Open up Chrome DevTools and try to see what happened. Oh, well, the script took really long, or let's load it again. Oh, your account, you're logged in, you have this flag. We didn't think about that. And if you have these metrics, then you can do what Jasenia was talking about, is set these performance budgets up. Right? And really try to keep yourself within these guardrails, these gutter bumpers that you put on the lane at the bowling alley. Try to stay within those guidelines, within those limits that you've set for yourself. We can set up these budgets, but in all of the examples of performance budgets that you've seen, the metrics that those performance budgets address are those ones that no user has ever expressed concern about, right? Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have those performance budgets, but those are secondary goals. They are ways, they are guidelines that are going to help us achieve the main goal of delivering a fast user experience. But we don't have any metrics, any performance metrics, that are telling us the speed of that user experience. So we really need to figure out what it is that we should be measuring, because we're not measuring the right thing right now when it comes to our primary concern. So I want to talk about measuring performance, and we'll take a little historical retrospective here, a stroll starting in 2002, when I started working on performance at Yahoo. We were using Keynote. Gomez was another popular system back there. I inherited this performance responsibility for my Yahoo, and I looked at these Keynote charts, and I thought my Yahoo was pretty fast, but these charts were telling us it was like a second, plus or minus a few hundred milliseconds, and that seemed really optimistic. So I peeled back the layers of the onion and said, what are we actually measuring here? And it turned out that those systems, when they started off, had much more of a back-end ops kind of focus. What they measured was how long it took to download the HTML document. One response. Most pages have 100 HTTP requests. These measure one response. You can see back in 2002, this is an actual Keynote chart from an actual website that was touting how they cut their performance in half. They cut the delivery time of their HTML document from 5 seconds to 2 seconds, right? For one response. So these clearly were not giving us a good picture. They were not a good proxy, a good approximation for what the user was experiencing. So when I saw this, I said, well, okay, we need to think of a measurement we can do that is going to more closely tell us what the user experience is like. Now remember, this is early, mid-2000s. So I said, well, why don't we do something with window.onload, right? We can put a timer in there, we can do this across, and we did. We rolled out this system called Roundtrip, and we deployed it across every Yahoo page, and it took a time measurement at window.onload, and it beaconed it back to us. So this was really cool. Now, we're not paying any other service to do performance measurements for us. We're getting metrics, performance metrics from all our users. And what's even better is these measurements that we were getting back reflected the geolocations of our real users, the hardware profiles of our real users, the connection speeds of our real users, because guess what? It was our real users. So this was really awesome. But it had some drawbacks, things that didn't work as well as we would like. There's no start time. I've got a pretty good end time, window.onload, but what's the start time? So what we did back then was we put this timer at the top of the page. We also had another hack where we would put a cookie in the on before unload. But for most pages, especially the first page view of the session, we had to rely on this timer on the top, which completely ignores that time to do the DNS lookup and get the initial HTML document. Another drawback is it's using get time, which John Resig famously noted has a fairly high latency, 50 to 100 milliseconds in many cases. So then in 2010, folks from Google and Microsoft banded together and formed the W3C Web Performance Working Group. And the first thing we started working on were these web timing specs to make it so that we could do a better job of measuring performance, much more accurate and reliable. So we came up with 3 specs. The navigation timing spec, which you can think of as overall time measurements for the page. And you can get at it. So this was the birth of one of the things that has made me very happy in my career, window.performance. There's actually a performance object built into browsers today. So you can do window.performance.timing, most notably .timing.navigation start. And that is a time value set by the internals of the browser, so it's not subject to JavaScript blocking or anything else, of when the user initiated their navigation to the next page, the page that we're actually trying to measure right now. So now we have a really accurate start time. Also, it came with performance.now, which is a high-resolution timer. So we don't have this get time latency in the time measurements that we're gathering. The second spec was the resource timing spec, where, again, we're getting this detailed timing information, DNS time, redirect time, TCP connect time, content download time for every HTTP request in the page. And you can get those objects, those measurements for each resource in the page by calling performance.getEntries. The last spec was something that was less about data and more about functionality. So it's the user timing spec. This is a set of code that we provided to let developers measure whatever they wanted to. So most notably, the popular APIs here are performance.mark and performance.measure, where you can set a mark, kind of like a milestone in places, from your perspective, in places throughout the page load sequence. And then you can do a measure, a delta between any of those 2 marks. So with these new specs, we were able to get much more accurate window.onload times from our RUM beacons. So that was fantastic. But at the same time, 2010, 5 years ago, a little earlier, a little later, we also found that pages became much more complex. The way that they were implemented and how content was being delivered and displayed in the page was changing greatly, such that window.onload no longer had a high correlation to what users were seeing and when it arrived. Let me demonstrate that with an example from 2 popular websites. One is Gmail. So I loaded these in web page test. It's great to see so many people referencing that fantastic performance tool. And you can script it. So I did a little scripting so it would actually log into Gmail with my account. And I can see these screenshots every 1/10 of a second and what the page looks like. When you load Gmail and the onload fires, this is what the page looks like. How many people think that reflects the content the user is waiting for? Very good, okay. It's not until about a second later, actually faster than I would expect, that you get most of the pixels in the viewport actually being painted. So if you were the Gmail team and you were using window.onload as your performance metric, it would be too rosy. It's overly optimistic. It's not an accurate reflection of what you're building and delivering to the user. Now on the flip side, what if we look at Amazon? I don't know about you, I think Amazon pages are kind of heavy, a little bloated. It has, they have all those reviews and cross promotion and my search history and everything. But if we look at the content in the viewport, that gets loaded in just 2 seconds, right? Now, it's true, onload doesn't fire until 9.7 seconds, 8 seconds later. Look at the size, I call it the elevator in the elevator shaft, the little scrolling box. Look how the size of that box has changed. Initially at 2 seconds, it's taking about, what, 50, 60% of the elevator shaft, and it shrinks down to like 15% or something like that. There's a whole bunch of content being loaded below the fold. I don't care. The stuff that I care about, the content that's visible to me, is displayed very, very quickly. Amazon has done a fantastic job of focusing on what the user is really waiting for and delivering that fast, enjoyable user experience. So if you were the Amazon team and you're using window.onload, it's really being hypercritical of the fantastic job that you're doing. So onload doesn't correlate well anymore with user experiences. So we can look at the nav timing spec at other possible metrics to use. And we see DOM Interactive. And just last month, I think, Netflix wrote an article about how they're using DOM Interactive because they feel that it's a better reflection of that user experience. So that might be true for them, but we can find some really popular websites where that is not the case. So here is CNN. Again, in web page tests. So I know DOM Interactive fires at this time. The DOM might be interactive, but there's really not much to interact with. I would not want to use this as the measurement of the experience I was delivering to users. And it could be worse than that. We have seen that. What is it with these media companies? There's nothing on the page at the time DOM is interactive. So again, DOM Interactive is this mechanical construct that no user cares about, defined by the browser about when parsers and DOM trees are actually created, and they may have no correlation to what the user is seeing. So then we come to speed index. So Pat Meenan, the creator of web page tests, came up with this metric that is just fantastic. It kind of represents the rendering experience of the entire page over time in one number. And there's a whole article and formula for how you can do it. You take the percentage of unrendered pixels at every interval of time, in this case, 1/10 of a second, and you take the integral of those over the whole rendering timeline, and you get this number in milliseconds of speed index. This has a much higher correlation than the other ones we've talked about. In fact, several years ago, the Chrome team switched from onload to speed index as the way to track to make sure they don't have performance regressions. But again, not perfect. Let's look at some examples. Here we have Bing and Discus. We can see DOM Interactive and window.onload, not a good metric to reflect delivering the content to the user that the user wants. Speed index, a little bit better for Bing, but again, speed index is the average pixel rendering time, so Discus is actually a better reflection of what speed index is measuring, and certainly the content that the user wants is not there. Two other popular sites, CNN and MSN, DOM Interactive, again, too early. There's not enough content there to be what we want to use to measure the user experience. Speed index, again, is giving us kind of an average in the middle rendering time. Onload is better, but still onload has missed in some of those other examples that we've looked at. So perhaps not too surprising, but as I've walked us through this history, we come to the conclusion, I hope, that there is no single built-in performance metric that we can use across all websites that will measure what the user experience is like. Anyone surprised by that? And yet, this is what everyone in the world is doing. We're using speed index, onload, DOM Interactive, some artificial metric that's been built from a mechanical perspective to try to approximate how quickly we're delivering content to users for our individual, very different websites delivered with different technologies, different techniques, lazy loading, preloading, asynchronous loading. They're not going to be accurate across the websites that we all work on. So if we really want to find a metric that is going to measure the user experience, we have to do something else. And that other thing is custom metrics. It's pretty simple. We've heard several people today talk about you need to know the critical content on the page. What are the critical design elements on the page? You need to identify those. Once you identify them, you can use that user timing spec, the mark and measure thing I talked about before, and you can measure how long it takes for that critical content to appear in front of the user. The beautiful thing about specs, especially the user timing spec, is because they're a standard, we get services like Google Analytics, Speed Curve, Web Page Test, Impulse, know that these numbers are in the browser, these custom metrics, these user timing marks and measures, know where they are in the browser, can pull those out and surface them in your dashboard without you doing any extra work for those specific services. So let's actually look at what a custom metric looks like. One of the first and perhaps the most famous custom metric that's been talked about is Twitter's article from 3 years ago, the time to first tweet. So in this article, they say that for them, more than any other metric, the thing they care about from a performance perspective is how long it takes for this tweet at the top of the timeline to get displayed. And if you're going to measure that, we should really focus on measuring how long it takes for the image to get displayed, because all the markup, the text and the image tag are going to come down at the same time, but we're going to have to do some extra work for the image, either download it over the internet or read it from the cache. So if we can get the time for that image to get displayed, we have the upper bound that will tell us the time for the overall tweet. So we want to come up with a custom metric for image, not load time, display time. Very different. So let's look at that markup for the tweet. It's got the image in there. And what we can start with is just adding an onload handler. And we're going to use performance.measure, and we're going to create our own time marker. We'll call it image displayed. And if you don't specify a start time, the default start time is navigation start. So this is going to tell us how many milliseconds it took from when the user initiated navigation to when the onload fired. And that's great, because when the onload fires, typically, if there's nothing else going on, is when the image is displayed. But most of our pages have other stuff going on. For example, style sheets. Hopefully you know, if you have a style sheet, it blocks everything in the page from rendering until it's done downloading. So suppose we have a huge style sheet that's really slow, right? That will start downloading. The entire page is blocked from rendering. The image will still be downloaded. It will download more quickly. The onload will fire. We'll get this time marker for image displayed, which is inaccurate because the image is not painted. The style sheet is blocking it. So we need to do something else. How are we going to deal with this situation? It's pretty simple. We'll add an inline script block right after the image tag. And it's going to take that measurement again, performance.measure image displayed. But now we have that image displayed measured twice. And what we really want is we want the maximum of those two values, the greater of those two values. Because the first one will tell us if there's nothing else blocking us but just how slowly the image loads, we can use the first number. If we have something blocking the image from loading, then this second number will give us the answer, because style sheets block all inline scripts from executing. This inline script will not execute until the style sheet is done. So we just take the greater of these two values. We can do that using a few other APIs, one other API in the spec, clear measures. So suppose the first one fires, the onload, we'll set an image displayed time, but then this huge slow style sheet finishes downloading, and the second block fires, it clears the previous time and sets a new time. So now we have a time value that is not when the image finished downloading. Users don't care about that. They care about when they see the image. And this is how you can measure when an image gets displayed. This is pretty important. No one has ever talked about this before. But this is where we need to start focusing on when users can actually see the content that we're delivering. And if you do that with user timing, like I said, it can get surfaced into these performance dashboards that you have automatically. So let's talk about the takeaways that I hope you'll get from this talk. First, we've had this history of metrics that are more on the mechanics of browsers and DOM trees. We need to focus our metrics on what the user sees. And unfortunately, for the metrics that are popular today in terms of performance, none of them are a good reflection of that user experience across all websites, and probably not for your website. So the answer is we need to implement these custom metrics using the user timing spec after identifying the key content on our page that's critical for delivering a great user experience. All right, thank you.